Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott, and I'm here to give you the definitive review of the Voigtlander 110mm f2.5 macro lens, and this is an APO-Lanthar is their designation, which means it's an apochromatic lens and uses their Lanthar optical design. And like Zeiss, they like to name their optical formulas, and so this is the APO-Lanthar design here. Now, the 65mm f2 APO-Lanthar macro lens, which is a 1:2, not a 1:1 like the 110mm, which, by the way, I'm filming on at the moment. I'll show you it close up and hands-on in just a moment, but I thought you might be interested to see in what footage looks like shot out of it. But the 65mm has been one of my favorite lenses on Sony, and I have used it for a lot of product type shots when I don't need to go to a 1:1 magnification level. I've also used it at weddings and for portraits, and I have been very, very happy with the end results. I mean, it's an incredible lens, and in many ways it gives me some of the optical quality that I love of, Zeiss lenses on Sony platform in a more moderate size and a little bit more moderate price. Fortunately, the 110mm, when it was introduced, it also interested me because it's a great focal length. It went to a 1:1 magnification, but also they retained a really fairly moderate price for it when you consider that this is essentially like a classic Zeiss lens. If you look at the Zeiss macro planar 100mm f2, that ran you closer to $2,000. This is about half that, and you can get one right now for under $1,000 at B&H Photo and other outlets. And so anyway, I was very interested in the release of that. And in many ways, I continue to be very optimistic about it. I'm going to do my best to give you as balanced a review of this I can, as well as a comparison to the 65mm. And by the way, if you are interested in the quicker review that just kind of gives you the highlights, into the end of the week I'll be releasing my kind of standard review that gives you everything in a more compact package. Today we're going to break things down in detail, from the build to the focus quality to the optical performance in detail. So if you want the details, you're in the right place. First of all, let's jump in and let's take a look at the build and handling of the lens and give you a closer look at it. So taking a closer look at the 110mm, what you see here is that we have a beautifully crafted engineered design that is very reminiscent of these classic Zeiss lenses. And so manual in that sense. However, what we do have here is we do have full electronics, and so everything is communicated. The active area will be magnified on the screen to help with visually confirming focus. What we don't have back here, however, is any kind of weather sealing. And so once again, like the classic Zeiss series, not like the newer Zeiss Milvus series that does have weather sealed bodies. So in terms of the physical size, you're actually very similar to the 65mm f2. Functionally, they are identical in their kind of diameter, both around 78mm. There's kind of a unique design here in that the 110mm actually kind of comes back to a narrower point, and so at this point it's only a 58mm front filter thread, and that compares to a 67mm front filter thread on the 65mm. And so what is also interesting, however, is that the included lens hood, which is also all metal, instead of bayoneting on, it actually screws into the filter threads. And so that does change things a little bit. You actually have a secondary included pinch cap at 67mm. And so, if you're going to use it in this fashion, you use this rather than this front cap. Also, the threading here is at 67mm, and so you can use filters in that size for that. Now, the disadvantage of a threaded design is that you cannot reverse the lens hood for storage. And so it's a little bit more of a pain to bring along, because you're basically either going to need to bring it in your bag or need to bring it attached. Now, as you can see, the physical length between these two lenses is quite similar. The 110mm is a little bit longer. It is right under 100mm compared to 91.3mm for the 65. And what does change the most, however, is that both of these lenses extend significantly during focus. And so the closer you get towards their macro level, the longer the length becomes. In this case, because the 65mm is only a 1:2 macro, while the 110mm is a full 1:1. The byproduct of that, however, is that, as you can see, there is a lot more barrel extension and a significant amount of extension from our 1:2 level, if we come to that. At that point, it's about equal in length, but there is a lot more extension from that. Now, the actual action is really smooth. However, I will point out this. If you're going from macro and you want to move back into the normal range, there is a lot of focus to do to get there. It's very, very smooth, very precise focus, but that extra amount of magnification actually makes it a little bit clunkier to use for general purpose as opposed to straight up macro use. I find that functionally the 65mm is a little bit easier to use for the simple reason that you don't have that as incredibly long a focus throw. One other area where I find a functional difference is when it comes to the aperture ring. Now, unlike a lot of, say, like the GM lenses, they also have an aperture ring. However, it is a aperture by wire. This is a fully mechanical aperture, and so while it will show on screen what your aperture change is, you are physically changing the aperture when you use the aperture ring. That functional difference, however, is when it comes to the actual aperture ring position. On the 65mm, it's up near the front, it's raised, it's quite easy to find just in a tactile sense. But in this case, if we attach the lens to a camera, what we find is, particularly if you're looking through the viewfinder, there's not a natural place where that aperture ring falls to hand. It's in a recessed position, and I just found it a little bit hard to find by feel. It's very fortunate that on screen you do see aperture changes, because the actual aperture ring position is hidden and it's not as clearly marked as what it is on some lenses. And so I just find that to be a functional difference that I don't necessarily love there. Now, because there is more glass due to the focal length here, and of course the fact that you've got a lot of extra barrel inside there, there is more weight in the 110 compared to the 65. The 65 weighs in at 625 grams, 1.38 pounds. 110mm is 771 grams, or 1.7 pounds. And because it is fairly dense, when it's in the fully retracted position like this, you will feel it being just a little bit front heavy, because there is a fair amount of weight that is located, right there. At the end of the day, it's still a moderate weight, but you definitely will feel that kind of sense of density that I associate with a lot of Zeiss type lenses, which this is very similar with. So 3 takeaways from this, particularly if you're kind of considering the 110 versus the 65mm. And in some ways you could look at them as complementary lenses if you really love the look of those lenses, and I certainly would understand that. But if you're looking at them as competing options, a few things that I do prefer about the 65mm, and that is in part the focus throw. Now, if you want 1:1 macro, the 110mm is the way to go. But if you're not and you're wanting more of a general purpose, I do like the 65mm a little bit better as a general purpose lens. I would say both as a focal length, but also definitely in the handling of the lens. I continue to wish that they could find a way to implement some kind of weather sealing into the design. That's becoming more and more standard, and these are premium lenses, and I certainly think that they deserve to have that next level applied to them. And so that's another thing I want to highlight. The other thing is I do find the whole lens hood situation suboptimal. I think that if I owned the lens, unfortunately there would be a number of circumstances where the hood stayed home, and even storing like in my storage cabinet, it makes it too long to store it reasonably with the hood attached. If you have the hood separate, where do you put the hood when you're not using it? And so I don't love that design from a design and engineering standpoint. And so I'll offer that as a criticism. Beyond that, however, the other handling is it's a beautifully designed, beautifully built lens, and both the aperture ring and the focus ring, they really do handle in a premium fashion. That aperture ring design, again, that's another area where I like the 65mm better. In terms of the overall focus, and as a portrait type lens, and we'll look at some portraits as a portrait shots as a part of the image quality in just a second. But when it comes to portrait, the good news for portrait use is that you're not going to have to go deep into that long focus throw for portraits. And there's enough focus throw that remains there that I think it works fine as a portrait type image. If you're wanting to shoot somewhere in that middle distance, and so let's say, within a meter away, and or a couple of feet, if you're looking at it that way, half a meter or so, I find in that range is where I don't love the long focus throw. It feels like I do a lot of focusing to get from infinity to that point, or from macro to that point. And so that's where I don't love the focus action as much. Furthermore, when it comes to video application, I'm actually in the process of testing a motorized gimbal right now, the Moza Aircross 2, and it comes with an actual cool drive system that you can actually set up the drive to optimize manual focus, to where you can do kind of focus pulls from down here. So I tried the 65mm, and even that, it was not a great story there. That focus throw is just too far for a lot of video work. And so as far as the footage, if you're doing static shots and you want a longer focal length, obviously it's capable of producing really beautiful footage. And so, big plus from that, because it's optically beautiful lens. However, for actual usage, it's a little bit more challenging to use. I would say a non-macro lens would be an easier lens to use in that kind of application. And so it's not a top pick to me for video, for that simple reason. If you're wanting to do any kind of focus throws, if you just want the focal length, go for it. It's going to provide really, really amazing footage. So let's break down the image quality in detail here. And so let's jump in and let's take a look at what you're getting in terms of performance. So first of all, let's take a look at vignette and distortion. So distortion, we can see that there is a tiny bit of pincushion distortion. You can see a little bit of an downward curve here. You can see the corrected version on the right is straight across. So it's not probably going to be enough to impact much of anything. However, this is not a perfectly corrected lens in terms of distortion. There's also some vignette with, some fairly significant vignette in the corners, not as heavy as what I've seen on some lenses, and then kind of a linear progression towards the middle. There'll be a number of situations where that vignette is useful, portrait situations. However, just know that it's there. It corrects cleanly and easily through either the in-camera profile for JPEG and then here in Lightroom with the profile. So one of the huge strengths for apochromatic lenses is the fact that basically longitudinal chromatic aberrations, either purple or green fringing before or after the plane of focus, are almost entirely eliminated. And you can see that to be the case here. I mean, you have a beautiful clarity of result there, very crisp. And then before the plane of focus, you can see that there is next to, well, I don't really see any chromatic aberration there at all. After the plane of focus, I don't see it either. So intensely good result there. So in terms of our resolution, looking here at wide open f2.5, you can see a really crisp result. That apochromatic design, it allows for really, really great clarity and micro contrast. It's not a coincidence that almost all of the Zeiss Otis lenses, actually all of them I believe, are apochromatic design, because that allows you to have just intensely good contrast and resolution, as we see here in the center of the frame. As we move towards the mid frame, we can see that the results are still very, very good, with a little bit of loss towards the outer third of the frame. And what I mean by that is that on this side of the bill, it's a little bit better than it is on the bottom corner. And down into the corner, we still have very, very good results, very strong into the corner. But what I am seeing is a little bit of loss of contrast towards the corner. And so we'll see how that compares to the 65mm. So what you see here is that we have the 110 on the left, we have the 65 on the right. And so 65 being at f2, wide open, f2.5 for the 110. So what we can see is if we look at the center of the frame and at our bill here, I slightly favor the look from the 110. They're very, very close. I just think there's a little bit more clarity there and maybe a tiny bit better just kind of brightness of image there. If we move off to the mid frame, however, my position reverses, and I think that what you're seeing is a little bit better micro contrast and a little bit more consistency from the left corner down to the right corner of the bill on the 65mm. And into the corner, I definitely favor the 65mm. That is, I mean, it is very close to perfect in the corner. And when you put these side by side, you can see that there's definitely less contrast in the corner of the 110mm than there is to the 65mm. So if we stop down 1/3 to f2.8, we can see that there's definitely a center improvement. The micro contrast is already good. Now it becomes exceptional and really, really fantastic result and a noticeably improved result. If we look off here towards mid-frame, the result, I don't find it as significant. And even if we look at kind of the lines here, I think that there's a little bit better contrast. The darks are a little bit darker, whites are a little bit brighter. It's not as noticeable as what it is in the center of the frame, and the same is true down into this corner. There's a mild improvement, but it's still not at the level of the 65mm. Just to make that point, here's the 65mm at f2.8, and you can see it is dramatically better in the corner in both contrast and just the crispness of the details. And so I would say it's the more consistent performer across the frame. You know, look at here and here. Definitely better on the 65mm. Now where we see our big leap here is at f4. You can see how noticeably better contrast is here on f4. It almost seems like there's a light haze here at f2.8. Moving off into the corner, contrast is better here as well. It's looking really, really good right across the frame. At f5.6, you see a step forward to where it is better yet and looking really, really fantastic in the corner of the frame. So if you remember looking at the bill in the center of the frame where we started off, the German Deutschmark, here you can see what 1-to-1 of that bill looks like. And if we jump into a pixel level, you can see that all of the weave of the fabric and the bill and the ink is really clearly delineated. Very, very impressive. Now here's a look at, kind of in a situation that would show off chromatic aberration and a loss of contrast. You can see that consistently across the frame, we have got a nice clean result here. A metal surface, we could see some chromatic aberration. We could also see a nice, background there, good result there. This really stood out to me, just, kind of an ordinary shot. I mean, I'm shooting in March. It's not the most beautiful time of year, pretty much anywhere. However, what you can see is that amazing micro contrast and really crisp delineation. And when I looked at this at a pixel level as we are right now, I thought, just wow. I mean, everything is so crisp, beautifully detailed. This is wide open, and so you can see the advantage of the Apochromatic design and that beautiful micro contrast there. And also, I would say the general rendering in this shot is quite nice as well. I happen to be in Virginia during this review period, and so already some cherry blossoms are starting to come on. And so what we can see here is with these blossoms, which are kind of high contrast because they're very, very bright against a dark background. And what I noticed with the 40mm f1.2 Voigtlander, which does not have an apochromatic design, definitely has lots of chromatic aberration by comparison, is that it had a really rough go with this kind of scene. We can see that the apochromatic design of the 110 does really, really great. Where the 40mm might win is that the background is a little bit softer by comparison, but overall I think that's quite a lovely image nonetheless. Now if I go a little bit further back, we can make some observations here. First of all, I mean, our resolution, real world resolution, looks really, really fantastic, and that, kind of great contrast in the image right across the frame. It looks really fantastic. You can see a mild drop off in the corner, but real world performance is beautiful here. Looking towards, this area here, it's not as smooth as the best lens that I've seen around this focal length. At the same time, however, it's not bad either. It's positive. Often apochromatic designs, this is where they kind of let you down a little bit in that there's still great contrast sometimes in the defocused area. I didn't see anything really that kind of deterred me. In this kind of situation, looking, number one, we've got great detail on our subject in terms of their faces. And here with the background further back, it's obliterated and it's just not an issue. Also here in kind of a more mundane scene, and so we've got, objects that, could be kind of attract the eye. We don't really see them. All the background kind of just blurs away. And here you can see beautiful detail rendered in these, kind of faint details on the dog's face and nose. Here's another kind of high contrast scene that shows you both some bokeh. You can see there's the kind of the typical cat eye deformation towards the edges, but also in the area of high contrast, the snow, this is where you definitely see lots of longitudinal chromatic aberrations. You can see, however, it just isn't there. And that's the beauty of a lens design like this. Another prime example is here. This is a high contrast kind of scene where if you don't control chromatic aberration, images become really kind of unusable. In this case, however, that great control has allowed this to be an artful type image, and not just an artful type image in the global look, but also in the details. The details look really fantastic. And so I really like what you're able to achieve with the lens. This is in the Luray Caverns in Virginia. And so, just kind of a cool shot, but shows that even in these kind of lighting conditions where I was having to go up a little bit higher ISO, but you can see, wide open, I had no problem in getting an image that is, very credible and usable and good right up into the corners. And it allowed me to shoot in, where I wanted to keep the ISO down, to shoot wide open and still get really good results. Of course, top down, this becomes a beautiful landscape lens. And so you can see, even though there's some of the layers of mist there, I really loved the, just kind of the composition of here and the bit of compression that comes from a slightly longer focal length. If you own this lens, I'd really recommend taking it out and using it in landscape type situations. You will be really pleased with the end results. Now, looking a little bit closer up, it is possible thanks to the IBIS in cameras. This is a handheld macro shot, so it is doable, and you can see that it's rendered the ice crystals kind of a frost crystal. Really cool, and I was able to do that handheld. Now, more traditional macro, this is shot on a tripod. You can see it's able to deliver the fine details, good results there. Here's another example here. This is wide open f2.5. And you can see there's, the detail is really good. It's definitely usable for a macro lens. It does macro stuff as you would want it to. Now, in terms of flare resistance, as we've seen already, it does come with a lens hood that can be a little bit awkward to use, but it does make a difference, not so much in this kind of situation. The lens hood is not going to help here because the sun is right in the frame. And so as you can see, what we see is a kind of a little bit of loss of contrast here with the bright sun right in the frame. In this case, I also wanted to show you the aperture shape and the sun star shape, which is actually fairly nice for a longer focal length. But you can see there are a little bit more ghosting artifacts. Now, if we look at video panning, I'll show you first of all without the lens hood attached. And so you can see that there's definitely some flaring, there's some veiling that will come, and a bit of ghosting artifacts. It's more the veiling that we see. Putting the lens hood on doesn't make a huge difference, when you're more faced on. What it may help is when the sun is in the corner of the frame, and it helps to shade the frame there. Now, stop down, contrast is better and there's less veiling. However, you can see some more pronounced ghosting artifacts. And the same is true with the hood attached rather than being unattached, that, it's going to more help from corner shading, not direct pointing into the sun. So finally, I had some requests to compare the Voigtlander to the Zeiss Milvus 135mm. So the Milvus is adapted here. And so, obviously the framing is different because of that. But if you want to get a sense of color and skin tones, so in both of these cases, I've actually profiled the lenses through my Datacolor Spider checker. And so there's custom profiles created for each one. So what you're seeing is very accurate color here. And I wouldn't say that there's a huge difference in terms of the coloration here. One of them is a little bit cooler and the Zeiss looks a little bit warmer. That could be just the color temperature of the image itself and the fact that they exposed a little bit differently. Also, the end result here is that both of them are really crisp in the details. Both of them render skin tones really nice. I think they're both great. I would say that the Zeiss has a little bit better micro contrast in some of these details. However, both of them, as you can see looking globally, create a beautiful type result that I would say it's more a difference in the compression of the focal length than it is in some kind of optical quality of the two. Both of them have beautiful color. So once again, the apochromatic design here really does the trick in terms of the punch of images. One thing that I love about Voigtlander is the color. Voigtlander lenses, and let's take a look at a few photos here together because I really love their ability to produce just gorgeous colors in a variety of situations. In that comparison shot when we were looking at a portrait, I think that I, ever so slightly favored the Voigtlander in terms of just the way that it handled the gradations of color in the portrait, and so that was nice. But they are very much, they're the only company outside of Zeiss, I think, that really provides kind of competitive color rendition to that. And so really, really beautiful colors. Also, that apochromatic design, you know, and the lack of any kind of haze on that allows those textures to really pop, and so great micro contrast. The bokeh is I think, fairly good. It's not as exceptional as some lenses that aren't apochromatic and less contrasty, but I think that the trade-off at the end of the day is images that are really beautiful. One thing that I will note, we took a look at the aperture earlier on. Voigtlander does not do a great job because there's no curvature, much like Zeiss, to the aperture blades. And so you start to see the aperture shape early and often. It's maybe a minor criticism, but for those that are really into bokeh highlights, bokeh balls as they're sometimes called, it's not as appealing for that with a lack of the rounded aperture blades. But overall, image quality is really, really stunningly good. However, surprisingly to me, at least in the copies I compared, I thought that the 65mm was the stronger of the two. And it's, you know, of course, that's a high benchmark. That is a lens that is right up there near the top of lenses I've tested in terms of its performance. And so the 110mm is good or better in the center, not as good at mid-frame and corners as what I saw. And so, you know, maybe a mild regression in some of the areas of the frame there. At the end of the day, however, I think as terms of a value lens, you have to be willing to commit to a manual focus lens, and you know, near $1,000 is still a very significant investment, a very large investment for some of you. Comparatively to a equivalent Zeiss type lens, however, the Voigtlander lenses tend to come across as a relative bargain. This particular lens, I would say, falls into that category in that I compare it to a lens to where it's performing at a near optical level to the, you know, like the macro planar lenses. And so when you're looking at it in that kind of light, it's almost a 50% reduction in price. So it's a pretty strong value when it comes to that. Now, Sony shooters, this is a Sony specific lens at this point. They also have a 90mm macro to choose from Sony. There are some other options out there. Laowa has a 100mm that is, compelling as well. But I think that in terms of if you can handle that long focus throw, there's none of these lenses I don't think are providing quite the color and overall pop as this, this particular lens. So it's really beautiful in that. If you're looking for one-to-one macro, it's tempting lens there. If you want more of a general purpose, you might consider the 65mm F2. At the end of the day, and this is spoken because I own other macro lenses, and I don't need it for one-to-one macro. For many times I reach for it because it's macro enough for my purposes, product photography, for example, and it produces beautiful results. I like the use of it. I like it better, I think, for a general purpose lens. But if you want a dedicated, one-to-one macro, you like that 110mm focal length, it's a really tempting lens. It's beautiful, and like other Voigtlander lenses, if you appreciate manual focus, this is manual focus done beautifully. It's manual focus done right. I'm Dustin Abbott, and if you look in the description down below, you can find linkage to both my full written review, also to the image gallery, so you can look at more photos from the lens. Beyond that, there are buying links there if you'd like to purchase one for yourself, along with linkage to, follow me on social media, sign up for my newsletter, support this channel by becoming a patron or becoming a subscriber. Thanks for watching, and have a great day.